Hello everyone, this is video lecture number 18, The Road to Independence. We have several sections we are covering today. The first looks at a compromise repudiated, and then the response of the Continental Congress. We're going to look at the rise of the countryside, which focuses on those rural colonists, Loyalist Americans, and then the beginning of armed resistance, the organization of the Second Continental Congress, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and independence declared. So let's begin. At the time of the Boston Massacre, the colonists did not know that the British government, beset by troubles at home, was again ready to succumb to an economic boycott. Ironically, Parliament debated repeal on the very day of the massacre and formally rescinded all the Townshend duties except that on tea in April 1770. In response to the massacre itself, the British pulled their troops out of Boston proper. As the relatively quiet period that developed after the traumatic events of 1770 revealed, the British government seemed willing, at least temporarily, to stop escalating the confrontation with the colonists. But when Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, it raised a new threat of economic monopoly. Colonists looked again to the tactics they had used against the Stamp Act. They also tried newer techniques, such as the threat of tar and feathering. Once again, Boston became the scene of vigorous action. A participant's account of the Boston Tea Party in 1773 illustrates the degree of organization and the effectiveness of that crowd operation. Not surprisingly, the Patriots turned again to economic boycott. The agreement was signed by 51 women of Edenton, North Carolina. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached Parliament, the members expressed outrage over the destruction of private property. Determined to punish Boston, which had become known as the metropolis of sedition, the British government passed something called the Coercive Acts. As they had done in response to the Stamp Act, the colonists convened an intercolonial Congress. This time it's called the Continental Congress. This opened in Philadelphia on September 5th in 1774 and deliberated until late October. As the textbook authors note, men of loyal principles at the Continental Congress supported a plan to create a new structure of empire. That plan was not adopted, and the Continental Congress became a milestone in the ongoing and organized opposition to Britain's renewed efforts to exert control over the colonies. Joseph Galloway wrote a proposal for ending the imperial crisis, but as you will see, the time for reconciliation had long passed. So let's get started with the road to independence. We're looking at 1771 through 1776. Your first section is a compromise repudiated. Samuel Adams established a committee of correspondence and formed a communication network between Massachusetts towns that stressed colonial rights. The burning of the Gaspé roused other states such as Virginia, Connecticut, South Carolina, and New Hampshire to set up their own committees of correspondence that would serve to communicate with other colonies. The committees sprang into action after the passage of the Tea Act, which ultimately relieved the British East India Company of paying taxes on tea it imported to Britain or exported to the colonies. The Tea Act made the East India Company's tea less expensive than Dutch tea, which encouraged, or they hoped would encourage, Americans to pay the Townshend duty. Radical patriots accused the ministry of bribing Americans to give up their principled opposition to British taxation by trying to make British tea cheaper. The patriots effectively nullified the Tea Act by forcing the East India Company's ships to return tea to Britain or to store it in public warehouses. The colonists weren't going to buy the tea. A scheme to land a shipment of the tea and collect the tax led a group of patriots into throwing all of the tea on that ship into the Boston Harbor. In 74, Parliament rejected a proposal to repeal the Tea Act and instead enacted 4 coercive acts to force Massachusetts into submission. The 4 coercive acts included a Port Bill, a Government Act, a New Quartering Act, and a Justice Act. Patriot leaders branded these acts as, collectively, the Intolerable Acts. The activities of the committees of correspondence created a sense of unity among all of the patriots. Many colonial leaders then looked to the Quebec Act of 1774 as yet another demonstration of Parliament's power to intervene in American domestic affairs, since it extended Quebec into territory claimed by American colonies and recognized Roman Catholicism. So let's go to the next section and look at the Continental Congress and how it responded. Delegates of the new Continental Congress, this new colonial assembly, met in Philadelphia in September of 1774 to address a set of controversial and divisive issues. Under Pennsylvanian Joseph Galloway's proposal, America would have a President General appointed by the King and a legislative council selected by colonial assemblies. Even though the council would have veto power over parliamentary legislation that affected America, the plan was rejected and seen as being far too conciliatory to Parliament and to the British. Instead, the First Continental Congress passed something called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances that condemned and demanded the repeal of the coercive acts, and it also repudiated the Declaratory Act. The Congress began then a program of economic retaliation, beginning with a non-importation agreement against British goods that went into effect in December of 1774. But the British didn't just sit there and take it. The British ministry banned the Continental Congress, and they called it an illegal assembly, and they refused to send commissioners to America to negotiate with this new body. The ministry declared that Americans had to pay for their own defense and their own administration, and they had to acknowledge Parliament's authority to tax them. It also imposed a blockade on American trade with foreign nations and ordered General Gage to suppress dissent in Massachusetts. So let's look at the countryside, the rising of the countryside. Ultimately, the success of urban-led patriots would depend on the actions of a large rural population. At first, most farmers had little interest in imperial issues, but the French and Indian War, which had taken their sons for military duty, and pre- and post-war taxes changed their attitudes. The urban-led boycotts of 1765 and 1769 had also raised the political consciousness of many of these rural Americans. Patriots also appealed to the yeoman tradition of agricultural independence, as many northern yeomen felt personally threatened by British imperial policy. Despite their higher standard of living, Southern slave owners also had fears similar to those of yeomen. So let's now turn to Loyalist Americans. Many prominent Americans worried that resistance to Britain would destroy respect for all political institutions, ending in mob rule. Other social groups, such as tenant farmers, the regulators, and some enslaved blacks, refused to support the resistance movement. Some prominent Americans of loyal principles denounced the Patriot movement and formed a small but ineffective pro-British party. But Americans who favored resistance to British rule commanded the allegiance, or at least the acquiescence, of the majority of white Americans. So our next section is the beginning of armed resistance. When the Continental Congress met in 74, New England was already in open defiance of British authority. In September, General Gage ordered British troops to seize Patriot armories and storehouses at Charleston and at Cambridge. In response to this, 20,000 colonial militiamen mobilized to safeguard these supply depots, the most famous regiment being the Minutemen of Concord. On April 18, 1775, General Gage dispatched soldiers to capture colonial leaders and supplies at Concord. He is following his orders to suppress dissent. Forewarned by Paul Revere and others, the local militiamen met the British, first at Lexington and then at Concord. As the British retreated, militiamen ambushed them from neighboring towns, with both sides suffering losses. So now 12 years of economic conflict and constitutional debate have ended in civil war. Our next section then is the Second Continental Congress. After losing battles at Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, in 1775, the Continental Congress created a Continental Army headed by General George Washington. Moderates, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, passed a petition that expressed loyalty to the king and requested the repeal of oppressive parliamentary legislation. Zealous patriots, such as John Adams and Patrick Henry, won passage of something called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. So the debate here is whether or not they should use force to engage against the British. The king refused the moderates' petition and issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition in August of 75. Hoping to add a 14th colony to the rebellion, the Patriot forces invaded Canada, and they took control of Montreal in September, but later failed to capture Quebec. American merchants then cut off all exports to Britain and its West Indian sugar islands, and Parliament retaliated with a prohibitory act, and it banned trade with the rebellious colonies. Lord Dunmore of Virginia organized two military forces, one white, one black, and offered freedom to slaves and indentured servants who joined the Loyalist cause. Faced with black unrest and pressed by yeoman and tenant farmers demanding independence, Patriot planters called for a break with Britain. By April of 1776, radical patriots had, through military conflict, transformed the North Carolina Assembly into an independent provincial Congress. And it instructed its representatives to support independence. By May of 1776, Virginia patriots had followed suit. So let's look at our next section, which is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Many colonists retained a deep loyalty to the crown, as to do otherwise might threaten all paternal authority and disrupt the hierarchical social order. By 1775, the Patriot cause was gaining greater support among other groups, such as artisans and laborers. Many Scots-Irish in Philadelphia became patriots for religious reasons, and some well-educated persons questioned the idea of monarchy altogether. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine published a document called Common Sense, which was a call for independence and republicanism. Common Sense aroused the general public and quickly turned thousands of Americans against British rule. Paine's message was not only popular, but also clear. It was to reject the arbitrary powers of the king and parliament and create independent republican states. So our last section is Independence Declared. On July 4th of 1776, the Congress approved a Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the main author of this declaration, justified the revolt by blaming the rupture on the king, George III, rather than on Parliament. Jefferson proclaimed that all men are created equal. They possess the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government derives its powers from the consent of the governed. By linking these doctrines of individual liberty, popular sovereignty, and republican government with independence, Jefferson established them as the defining values of a new nation. Colonists celebrated everywhere. They celebrated the Declaration by burning George III in effigy and by toppling statues of the king. These acts helped to break ties to the monarchy and to establish the legitimacy of republican state governments. Okay, this does conclude our video lecture for today. There was a lot to it, so make sure you are paying close attention to your reading. This is an important section. And at this time, please address the review questions at the bottom.